Cuba says its soldiers killed 4 people and wounded 6 others aboard a Florida-registered speedboat that had entered Cuban waters. Joining us to discuss this is John Suarez, Executive Director at the Center for a Free Cuba. So, John, good afternoon to you. Now, Cuba accused the people on the speedboat. Good afternoon. Accusing them of planning an infiltration with terrorist aims. They say those on the boat opened fire first. To start off, I just want to have us take a look at what Secretary Rubio is saying.
What I'm telling you is that we're going to find out exactly what happened and who was involved, and then we'll make a determination on the basis of what we find out. And we're going to find out, but we're not going to just take what somebody else tells us. We're going to find out, and I'm very confident we will be able to know the story and be able to independently verify facts about it.
So, John, in addition to Rubio, Florida Attorney General James Uthmeier telling Fox News the Cuban government cannot be trusted. So what are your thoughts right now on this situation?
Well, the Cuban government is not a reliable narrator. As recently as October 28th of 2022, the Cuban Coast Guard attacked and sank a boat carrying refugees. And in this case, we're talking women and children were among the killed. And they prepared their own narrative. And then when the mother of one of the children killed broke that narrative, she was arrested. So this dictatorship is in a desperate moment trying to distract attention, I believe, from the call by members of Congress to have Raúl Castro, General Raúl Castro, indicted in the murder of 4 members of Brothers to the Rescue 30 years ago today. He's no longer head of state, so it's open to have him indicted for murder and brought to trial to face justice. And I think that's one of the factors of why the Cuban government want to be distracting with what's taking place at the moment.
So what do you think? Let's just imagine here. What might be the consequences if any of the dead or wounded turn out to be U.S. citizens or residents?
It all depends on the circumstances of what took place. And again, we cannot rely on the Cuban government's version of events. So there needs to be an investigation. I think Secretary Rubio is spot on in his comments, as well as other members of Congress, that there needs to be a serious investigation, get to the truth of what took place, who was impacted, and from there you determine what needs to be done. I think it's premature to speculate on what course of action to take when all you have is the Cuban dictatorship's version of events.
All right, understood. So I have another clip here of Rubio talking about the Cuban regime. Let's just take a look at it.
The people of Cuba are suffering today. They've been suffering for a long time. They're suffering now, perhaps more than at any time in recent memory, perhaps in the history since 1959. This is the worst economic climate that Cuba has faced. And it is the authorities there in that government who are responsible for that. They're the ones that have made decisions that have left Cuba vulnerable to the situation they're now in.
So, John, per your expertise, what is the situation right now that the Cuban people are facing?
The Cuban people are facing the worst economic downturn in the regime's history. But this is because the regime, since 1959, for the most part, has been in a downward trajectory with respites, for example, when they were able to hook up into Venezuela and drain them dry of their riches over a period of time. But even during that period of time, when they had large amounts of oil that they were reselling on international markets, people were still on the ration book. People were still suffering. Now that Mr. Maduro is gone, they're in a much more difficult situation. But again, the reason the situation is difficult is because you have communist central planning by Havana. They refuse to reform their system. And concretely, food, 80% of the food that Cubans eat is imported from abroad. The top exporter of food to Cuba today is the United States. Prior to 1959, Cubans were able to feed themselves. They were able to produce enough food to be self-sufficient. But when Fidel Castro arrived on the scene, collectivized agriculture, set up an acopio system, which was a government monopoly over food, food has been a scarce commodity in Cuba, and that's why they've been having to import it. The moment they stopped jailing farmers for trying to sell their produce to other Cubans and farmers are able to produce and sell their produce in markets in Cuba, you will see a change in the plight of the Cuban people. But this dictatorship over the last 67 years has refused to do that. There are farmers locked up today because they were growing chicken, cattle, fruits, and vegetables, and were trying to sell it directly to other Cubans. And the Cuban government wants them to deliver it to an acopio, which is a government agency. And we know from independent reporting inside the island that when you send it to the government agency, up to 50% of that food rots, and the farmers aren't paid on time. So there's also a factor that discourages them from production when dealing with the state.
So, John, you mentioned briefly that Nicolas Maduro has been arrested by the U.S. I just have a question for you on that. What has been the impact of that? What has been the impact of the oil embargo on Cuba? And what is the U.S. really doing to make sure that the oil doesn't get into Cuba?
Well, the media coverage around this, which shows piles of garbage in the streets of Havana, and tries to attribute that to the oil embargo, hasn't paid attention over the last several years that the garbage has been accumulating, because there hasn't been gasoline for ambulances and for other vehicles that would directly help the Cuban people. What there has been gasoline for is the police cars, the cars of the secret police to repress the Cuban people. Thus, one of the things that we're seeing post-January 3rd is that the regime is much more desperate, because they know when the fuel runs out for their vehicles, they're going to have an issue next time you have an uprising. But I would like to mention, yesterday the Treasury Department did announce that the United States will permit the sale of Venezuelan oil to Cuba, but not to the Cuban government, to private entities in Cuba. Now, that's a bit of a challenge, because most of the private entities in Cuba are linked to the Cuban military. So that's going to require a great amount of discretion and discernment by the U.S. government in who to award that possibility to in terms of receiving oil from abroad.
Right. I mean, that does seem like it is a challenge. But let me ask you something else as well. So Representative Carlos Gimenez said in a statement saying that the regime in Cuba must be relegated to the dustbin of history for its countless crimes against humanity. And he also said on Fox News that the regime is in its weakest position right now, on top of President Trump saying that Cuba will be falling pretty soon. So in your view, what do you think here? Is the Cuban regime on the verge of toppling?
I think the regime won't fall of its own accord. I think it needs to be pushed. But I do think things like the regime had lied for decades that they did not have a military and intelligence presence in Cuba. The 32 members of the military and Cuban intelligence that were killed during the U.S. operation to extradite Maduro exposed that lie, and also exposed it exposed that the myth of the Cubans' intelligence service and military being so top-notch and being able to compete with the U.S., it was dealt a body blow psychologically, and I think that hurts it within the populace. Secondly, Cuba currently has at least 7,000 Cuban mercenaries fighting in Ukraine, and they've been denying that they've been forcibly encouraging that, but obviously their relationship with Russia, the military agreements with Belarus, which is also assisting Russia in the war in Ukraine, indicates that there is a large Cuban presence. The Ukrainian intelligence service says that since 2022, with this latest round of the war, there have been over 25,000 Cuban mercenaries fighting in Ukraine for Mr. Putin. And that also takes away some of their resources to repress inside of the island.
Okay, really great hearing your analysis today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.